The orange sun sets on yellowing trees. A gentle breeze slithers its way through the forest. October leaves dance in the cool air. As the full moon rises above the horizon, your village becomes quiet as you and your neighbors head into your homes. Doors are barricaded, windows boarded up, and livestock all locked in their pens. All you can do now is wait for sunrise, and hope the losses this month will be less than last. You lay quietly in your bed, flintlock pistol in hand, wishing just once you could sleep through what was about to happen. But sleep continues to evade you, and as the minutes turn into hours, you naively begin to think, maybe it's over. Maybe all these months of torment have finally come to an end. But then you hear it. A distant howl, followed by an unmistakable silence. Like the entire forest is holding its breath, waiting for the horror to begin. Suddenly, chaos erupts outside, the terrified bleats of sheep cut short by growls and snarls. Your grip tightens around your pistol. A board from the window across the room lands broken at your feet. You raise your gun and fire at the now open window. Your ears ring, but as your hearing returns, a heavy guttural breathing catches your ears. Squinting towards the dark window, you can see the silhouette of a hulking, hairy creature. Quickly, you begin to reload your pistol. You can hear the beast's claws against the window as it pulls itself inside. It rushes towards you as you raise your weapon. A bloody, fang-filled snout clamps down between your neck and left shoulder, and you and the creature fall to the ground. Instinctually, you place the barrel of your pistol against the monster's throat and pull the trigger. Its jaws release, its teeth slide out of your flesh, and the injured creature quickly retreats out the way it entered. You tear your shirt and tie it tightly around your wound, sitting on the floor until the sun begins to rise. You realize you have just barely survived an encounter with the werewolf. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Lone Crow Podcast. I'm your host, Douglas Mackay. Tonight we're going to take a look at one of my all-time favorite monsters, the werewolf. It might be the only monster that I found more awesome than scary when I was a kid. So let's get started, shall we? What is a werewolf? Simply put, a werewolf is a human that turns into a wolf. But that's a huge oversimplification. I'm going to break it down a little bit by starting with the supposed ways people have become werewolves. Now, some believe it to be a curse, cast on men by gods, devils, or witches. Other stories claim you can be transformed into a werewolf simply through bad behavior. It is said that if cursed, you transform against your will under the light of the full moon. If the curse of the werewolf was cast upon you, it was thought to be permanent, the only cure being death. Other stories told of a special garment made of wolfskin that could be worn, granting the ability to become a wolf, thus making the ability to transform a choice. In some stories, this garment was gifted to someone by the devil. Then there were potions or ointments that could be made and consumed that would transform the user into a wolf. Much like other legends, the werewolf legend was changed and added to as time went on. Later stories told that a man could become a werewolf if bitten or scratched by another werewolf. There are a multitude of ways that one can become a werewolf listed online, but these seem to be the most common. Now we'll take a quick look at how werewolves have been described through legend. It seems that the majority of the original tales of the werewolf told of men or women transforming into common wolves. Some stories state that they're nearly indistinguishable from any other wolf, while others claimed that werewolves didn't have tails due to the absence of one in human beings, or that werewolves were much larger than regular wolves. Some also claimed that a werewolf kept its human eyes and voice. I think most of us that think about the werewolf nowadays probably picture the more human-like Wolfman. This was the monster I thought was so awesome when I was a kid. The head of a wolf on a fur-covered, muscly body. Big hands with large claws and the ability to walk upright. Your more typical movie werewolf. It wasn't just the beast form of werewolves that people described, though. Many believed that you could tell just by looking at a man if he was a werewolf or not. A unibrow, long curved fingernails, low set ears, and a swinging stride were all deemed characteristics of a werewolf. It was thought that if you cut the flesh of a man and checked the wound, you'd be able to see fur within the wound if the man was a werewolf. Now finally, we'll quickly sum up how to kill a werewolf. Much like garlic is to vampires, it is said wolfsbane is to werewolves, acting as a natural deterrent. But that's not enough to kill one. The most common weapon that I'm sure most of us know is a gun with a silver bullet, or a silver club or sword. And if all else fails, do as Europeans did in the Middle Ages and burn the beast alive. So why were werewolf stories told? It seems that any true lesson being taught by werewolf legends has become lost through time. But by looking at what the werewolf represents, I think we can make some fair assumptions. Historians tend to look at the werewolf stories as a way of demonizing mankind's more animalistic side. Whether it's rage, violence, or sexual urges, these stories serve as a way of telling people that those urges should be ignored, or you risk becoming the animal you act like. Much like the Wendigo, it seems to be a way to make sure people fall into line with the rest of society, and adopt that society's moral standards. It may also be a way of teaching children in a society about the animals that they should be afraid of. By anthropomorphizing these animals, you can give them traits to make them seem more cunning and dangerous, and ultimately more scary, so children know to fear them if they see them. Most commonly, though, werewolf stories seem to be a way to make sense of the most vile members of a society, the murderers and cannibals that target the most vulnerable people around them. It seems, without a deep understanding of the human mind, people truly couldn't comprehend what would drive a man to act in such an animalistic way, and so he must have been part animal. So, where did the werewolf legend begin? The true origin of the werewolf legend is impossible to place at a specific point in history, or even within one culture. It seems legends of animal transformations have persisted since essentially prehistory, and were told independent of each other all around the world. But we can start with the oldest known written work on the planet, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written around the year 2000 BC in Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq, the epic tells of Gilgamesh refusing to love the goddess Ishtar due to her mistreatment of previous lovers. One of those lovers was a shepherd, that Ishtar turned into a wolf so he would be hated by all those he was once closest to. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus reported that a tribe known as the Neri, or Nerians, would transform into wolves once a year and remain wolves for several days. They would then return to their human form. He doesn't delve into too much detail about the purpose of the transformation, but some believe he was referencing some practice of shamanism. In the year 8 AD, Roman poet Ovid published The Metamorphoses, which briefly tells a story about Lycaon of Arcadia. In one popular telling of the myth, Lycaon kills his own child and serves his flesh as dinner to Zeus, or Jupiter depending on which version you're telling. Zeus immediately recognizes the human meat and resurrects the child, then curses Lycaon to take the form of a wolf, to live like the beast that he truly is inside. I've heard that some make a direct connection between King Lycaon and the word lycanthropy, which is another term for werewolf, but according to what I could find on the etymology, it actually comes from the Greek words lykos, meaning wolf, and anthropos, meaning human being. The only connection they share is the root word lykos. Late 1st century AD, Petronius of the Roman Empire wrote the Satyricon. In it he tells a tale of a slave off to visit a woman he is madly in love with. He has a soldier companion with him, and as they're walking along the roadside, the soldier heads into a nearby graveyard. The slave sits patiently, singing to himself. He mentions in the story that the moon is as bright as midday. When the soldier returns, he has stripped himself of all of his clothing. He puts the clothing in a pile on the ground and urinates around them, turning the clothing into stone. He then proceeds to transform into a wolf and take off into the woods. The slave, in utter disbelief, quickly makes his way to the inn where his lover is. Upon arriving, he sees there's blood all around the room. His lover tells him of a wolf that had come in and attacked them, but a servant wounded the beast, spearing it in the throat. The following day, the man visits the soldier's barracks, where he finds a doctor treating the soldier for a deep wound in his neck. Some historians think that the brief mention of the moon in this story is how the full moon became associated with werewolf lore. So those are some of the earliest known tales of werewolves in history, but the stories don't end there. We're going to jump ahead a few centuries to the 1500s, when werewolves became as common in the court of law as thieves. And one of the most famous cases of lycanthropy took place between 1564 and 1859. Known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, Peter Stumpp was a German farmer that was accused and then confessed to murdering and eating 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and their unborn fetuses. One of those 14 children was his own son, whose brain he claimed to have devoured. Stumpp, while stretched on the rack, told how he had practiced black magic since he was 12 years old. He claimed the devil had given him a magic belt that, when worn, would transform him into, quote, the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body, and mighty paws, unquote. Removing the belt would return him to his human form, but after an investigation, no belt was ever found. Along with being a serial murderer and a cannibal, Stumpp was also accused of having an incestuous affair with his daughter, who was also sentenced to die along with him, as well as with a distant relative, which was also considered incest. Stumpp also claimed to have relations with a succubus that was sent to him by the devil. Stump's execution took place October 31st, 1589, and it is one of the most brutal executions on record. He was put to a wheel where flesh was torn from his body, in 10 places with red-hot pincers. Then they took the pincers to the skin of his arms and legs. His limbs were then broken with the blunt side of an axe so he would not be able to return from the grave. And finally he was beheaded, burned on a pyre. After all that, local authorities then erected a pole with the torture wheel and a figure of a wolf on it. At the top of the pole they stuck Peter Stump's severed head. Now that's only the most known of these trials. Between 1520 and 1630 in France, about 30,000 people were accused of being werewolves. Many of those accused underwent brutal interrogation and torture, similar to the witch trials that were going on at the same time. One such case happened in 1573. After the disappearance of several children, authorities in the town of Dole put a bounty out, encouraging the citizens to capture and kill the werewolf responsible. One evening, a group of workers traveling from a neighboring town came upon what they thought in the dim light to be a wolf, but what others recognized as a hermit that lived in the woods nearby. With him was the body of a dead child. Soon after, Gilles Garnier was arrested. During a trial, he claimed that while hunting in the woods, a specter came to him and offered him an ointment that would allow him to take the form of a wolf, making it easier for him to hunt. Garnier confessed to stalking, killing, and eating at least 4 children between the ages of 9 and 12. Garnier was found guilty of lycanthropy and witchcraft and burned at the stake on January 18, 1573. Another case took place in 1589, the Werewolf of Cod. Jacques Rowlett was tried for killing and eating a 15-year-old boy. He was discovered in the woods, half naked with long matted hair, hands covered in blood, still holding a lump of flesh. At his trial, he described how he had killed various people, including lawyers, attorneys, and bailiffs. His sentence was death, but he was later sent to a madhouse. He only remained in the madhouse for 2 years. Now, there are hundreds of these cases throughout history, and I may dedicate a future episode to just reading some of the more interesting ones. I find the stories of these trials very interesting, if not slightly morbid. There are still sightings of werewolves today, though they tend to feature the monster we see on the silver screen. So let's jump a few more centuries ahead to 1991 and cross the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. One of the most famous modern-day werewolf stories is that of the Beast of Bray Road. Described as a tall, fur-covered creature with legs that bent back like a dog, a large canine-like head, arms with clawed hands, and the ability to walk upright, the beast became known very quickly. Reported just outside of the small town of Elkhorn, Wisconsin, a high school senior driving down Bray Road on Halloween 1991 heard a thud and thought she had hit an animal. She stopped to see what she had hit. She saw a large shape in the road, but it was big, too big to be someone's dog. It stood on 2 legs and started running towards her. She said she could hear its feet hitting the road as she ran back to the car. The creature lunged for her car and left 2 large sets of claw marks down the trunk. This was the first of what became a series of reports about a monster along Bray Road. In the summer of 1992, a young man filed a report about a large, smelly, white and gray beast along the side of the road. As they passed, he claimed it reached out and scratched the side of his car, removing paint from the door. Another report came from a young single mother, who was driving home from her shift at a bar in town. As she headed down Bray Road, she noticed something large, hunched over in the ditch, and it looked to be holding and eating some kind of roadkill. It looked up at her, and she sped away immediately. I got these reports from a documentary called The Bray Road Beast on Amazon. Definitely check it out if you'd like to learn more about the sightings and hear other reports. There are also stories of the Michigan Dogman, but I want to cover that in a separate episode, as it seems to be a different creature than the classic werewolf. So what makes the werewolf scary? Now, I think there's a couple reasons that the werewolf was so feared throughout history, and they're fairly similar to the Wendigo from the first episode. Just like the Wendigo, a werewolf loses its human form, and whether that means transforming into what is a feared predator or some combination of man and beast, you see the loss of the pure human form, and only some twisted version of it remains. There's also the loss of control. The bloodlust that leads to a werewolf killing indiscriminately only because that's what it's supposed to do. I personally think the biggest fear factor when it comes to the werewolf is that it became, and to an extent has remained, a synonym for the most evil members of society. Take for example Mikhail Popkov. Dubbed the Werewolf by Russian media, he was serving a life sentence for killing 22 women between 1998 and 2007, only to be found guilty in the murder of another 56 women. These are the people that lust for death, the kind of people we struggle to understand or identify with. We can't understand their bloodlust, their need to kill, or their lack of empathy or conscience, and so we label them animals or monsters to dehumanize them and cast them out of our society. But we fear that they are always on the outskirts, on the edge of town, in the darkest woods, watching us, waiting for one of us to stray from the safety of our community so that they can strike. The werewolf lives on in other aspects of modern society as well, but not so much as the vicious man-turned-beast. Some modern researchers have tried to explain lycanthropy by linking it to legitimate medical conditions. In 1963, Dr. Lee Illis of Guy's Hospital in London wrote a paper in which he argued that some werewolf sightings could be attributed to sufferers of a condition known as porphyria. He believed that the symptoms of photosensitivity, reddish teeth, and psychosis could have been grounds for accusing someone of being a werewolf. The obvious argument against that claim, however, is that werewolves of mythology were almost always depicted as actual wolves, not the humanoid creature we think of today. Other researchers have pointed towards a condition known as hypotrichosis, a hereditary trait in which the afflicted has an excess of hair growing all over their body. It seems like it could have some link, but due to its rarity, it wouldn't explain the mass number of werewolf accusations and trials that took place through history. Another suggestion was that perhaps rabies was the culprit behind the werewolf legend. It sounds like it could explain a lot of the symptoms: aggression, confusion, hallucinations, sensitivity to light and sound, and many other terrifying symptoms. And on top of all of that, it's transmitted through the bite of an infected animal. But rabies is 99.9% fatal, and death usually occurs within days of the symptoms showing up. Plus, the transmission through bite trope in the werewolf legend didn't really show up until much later in history. Whether it is or isn't any of the previous ailments, there is one medical condition that is directly related to werewolf lore, a syndrome known as clinical lycanthropy, defined as a person with delusions that they can transform into, have previously transformed into, or is an animal. According to a study done by Dr. Jan Dirk Blom, an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, there have been 56 case descriptions since 1850 of people that believed they changed into animals. Of those cases, 13 of them met the criteria for clinical lycanthropy. Those 13 cases were specifically the delusion that one could become a wolf, while others share similar delusions but with a different animal as the subject. Dr. Blom was quoted as saying, quote, "I had expected to find more cases because in textbooks the condition is mentioned quite often in passing," unquote. But with so few cases in the last 150 plus years, it seems that clinical lycanthropy is quite rare. Now, Blom did go on to mention that many cases of clinical lycanthropy are missed due to mental health professionals being, quote, "insufficiently aware of the existence and the uniqueness of this disorder," unquote. The condition is thought to be an unusual expression of other psychological disorders. After reviewing all 56 cases, he found that 25% were diagnosed with schizophrenia, 23% with psychotic depression, and about 20% with bipolar disorder. I'm assuming the other 30% fell into other similar mental disorders. He found 34 of the patients were men and 22 were women, and their symptoms lasted anywhere between a single hour to decades. One man was convinced he had turned into a wolf and was admitted to an asylum in France in 1852. He claimed he had wolf's teeth, cloven hooves, and a body covered in long hair. He said he only wanted to eat raw meat, but refused it when it was given to him because he claimed it wasn't rotten enough. Another man claimed he saw the head of a wolf when he looked at himself in the mirror. Over the past few decades, brain imaging technology has helped scientists map the brain, and they believe that many of these cases could be linked to some problems in the area of our brain that gives us a sense of our physical identity. Obviously, the werewolf has lived on for thousands of years in stories and legend, and it continues to do so in pop culture. According to an IMDb list, as of 2017, there were 238 movies about or featuring werewolves, from the classic Wolfman films by Universal to the Underworld franchise. They fall in nearly every genre, from horror to romance to action. One of my personal favorite movies featuring werewolves is Trick or Treat. It's my go-to Halloween film, and the werewolves in it are pretty awesome in my opinion. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the transformation scene in An American Werewolf in London. It's a scene that you can't unsee, and it captures the horror and agony of losing yourself to the curse of lycanthropy. On top of the hundreds of films with werewolves, there are probably thousands of books out there featuring the werewolf. It seems people have been writing about them since the invention of literature. A classic werewolf story many of us had as kids is Little Red Riding Hood. Stephen King also has a short horror novel called Cycles of the Werewolf, which features a werewolf tormenting a town through the cycle of the full moons. And of course, there are a number of video games featuring werewolves as well. The Wolf Among Us was a critical success when Telltale Games released it in 2013. But my favorite game to play when I need a dose of lycanthropy is The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. The power that game gives you when you decide to become a werewolf is just too much fun. If any of you have suggestions for good werewolf media that I can consume, I'd love to hear from you. Or, if you have a scary story you'd like to share on the podcast, email me at lonecrowpod@gmail.com. That's LONECROWPOD@gmail.com. You can join the murder on social media. Just search @LoneCrow_pod on Instagram and Twitter, or follow me on Facebook at The Lone Crow Podcast. Subscribe to Lone Crow on YouTube. All episodes of the podcast will be posted on the channel, as well as future horror projects that I have planned. Thank you to Cash Lewis for designing the Lone Crow logo and for doing all the artwork for the podcast. Check him out on Instagram at illcashlewis. That's ILLCASHLEWIS. Thank you to Brastulu for creating the theme song for the podcast. And last but not least, thank you to all of the new listeners. I was so happy to see so many people enjoying what I put together here, and I can't wait to see where the future takes us. If you'd like to take the podcast on the go, the Lone Crow Podcast is now available on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify, so you can download it for later. If you could also leave a review on iTunes, it would help me out a lot. The more people that find the podcast, the more people we can welcome into this little horror community. So thank you all very much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Lone Crow Podcast.